I'm Sam Annunziato, and this is my presentation on solving the Icelandic gene bank problem. So, some background information. In 1998, the Icelandic Parliament gave Decode permission to begin creating a gene bank using its long history of gathering people's medical data. And they did this with what is called the Icelandic Health Sector Database Act. And here are a few relevant details to the legislation. So firstly, it was on an opt-out rather than an opt-in basis. And so what that means is, by default, the law assumed everybody was opted in. And if you wanted to get out, you had to fill out paperwork to get removed, instead of being opt-in. And what that would mean is the assumption would be nobody wanted in. And if you wanted to be included, then you would fill out the paperwork to join in. And so the original legislation was opt-out, meaning the assumption was everybody was in. The problem with this was it lacked what is called informed consent. And informed consent is an idea that's articulated in the Nuremberg laws and the Icelandic codes. And what it means is, in order for somebody to consent to anything medically, they have to have a baseline or certain understanding of what it is they're consenting to. And the problem with an opt-out basis is when you assume that everyone's consenting, you don't know if they're informed or not. And so that was the first problem with the Icelandic Health Sector Database Act, which is it didn't have informed consent. The second problem, which became very relevant, and we'll talk about later in the Supreme Court case that struck this down, was that it gave Decode access to what is called personally identifiable data. And what that means is, so when they gathered people's genetic information, they had their genes that they could look at, medically, but that was connected to the personal information of the person that the genes came from. And so, you might turn in your genetic information to the gene bank, but then it's attached to your name, your address, where you're from, your ethnicity, et cetera, et cetera. And, well, that's a violation of personal freedom, that this thing that you can't even consent to automatically gives this private company all of that personal information. And so originally, Decode said, we're going to encrypt the information. And what that means was they were going to put a wall between the genetic information that they were going to look at and examine, but they were not going to be able to access the personal information that it came attached to. Well, in an interview, Decode admitted that they had a key to break that wall and see all the personal information that your genes were connected to. And they did this with good intentions. The reason was because if they looked at someone's genes and they found someone was at high risk of a disease, they wanted the ability to contact them. But the problem is that it meant that all of genetic information was personally identifiable. It could be traced back to personal information. And so what this sets up, though, is a trade-off, because the gene banks really have a very good medical use and utility, which is if you collect a big enough sample of genes in your, a large gene bank, you can examine that and really find some great useful medical discovery to save lives. But if the process in which you get that information is tyrannical, it violates people's personal freedoms. And so you have a trade-off between, medical safety and innovation against, it's in a trade-off relationship with personal freedom. And so the Icelandic Supreme Court, made a ruling on this trade-off, and they sided with personal freedom over medical security. And so what happened was, a young lady whose father died, because her father was dead, he was not able to fill out the paperwork to get his genes removed from the bank. But the young lady didn't want her genes in the bank. But her father, who shares half her genetics, had his genes in the bank, and there was nothing they could do to get them out. And, well, she felt that it was a violation of her personal freedom because half of her genome was in possession of a company that could look at it and find personal information. And the Supreme Court sided with her and struck down the law. So I'm going to argue, with the remaining couple minutes of this presentation, that the trade-off relationship between personal freedom and medical safety, it can actually be managed. There's a way that we can get the best of both sides. So to understand, I've already explained that the problem's in a trade-off relationship, but to understand it further, I want to explain how people interact with the trade-off relationship on a personal level. And the best way to understand that is through a model, what behavioral scientists call the prisoner's dilemma. And what the prisoner's dilemma is when someone has two options. They can either defect or cooperate. Defecting is when your choice is safe. It doesn't influence your welfare. It won't harm you. It won't help you. Okay. The other option is to cooperate. And when you cooperate, you make yourself vulnerable because you could potentially be harmed. But if there's enough mutual cooperation, you can actually be helped. Okay, here's an example. Say you want to go to the store. You can defect and say, no, I'm not going to drive. It's too dangerous. Or you can cooperate and say, I am going to drive to the store. I'm going to take the risk of potentially getting into a car accident. But if everybody else cooperates and drives safely and follows the rules, I'll get the benefit of being able to drive where I want to go safely. Okay, so that's how the prisoner's dilemma is the way in which people interact with trade-off relationships. And so the solution is, if we can get people to cooperate, we can build up a gene bank that's very medically useful without having to use any harsh, tyrannical, violative laws. We could protect people's personal freedom and get the medical security. Now, the problem with that, some might say, is, well, that's very naive to assume that everyone on their own is just going to choose to cooperate, right? Because the benefit of using a strong, tyrannical law is you get to force people to cooperate. And some might argue that if you don't have that force, people won't cooperate. But the behavioral science literature says otherwise. What the behavioral science literature found is that when people are around other people with similar qualities, this is called homogeneity, homo meaning same. Homogeneity is a predictor of trust. And so when people are around people that are similar to them, they're very willing to cooperate. And it turns out Iceland is extremely, extremely homogenous. One of the most homogenous countries in the world, in fact. And so, well, logically, you would have to, accept or assume that on their own, people are very willing to cooperate. And there's evidence of this. You don't even have to think hypothetically about gene banks. All over, in all sorts of political examples, Iceland is always setting up people with the choice between cooperating and defecting, and they choose to cooperate, right? High taxes, I would argue, is an example of that because, well, you could not pay for the social program and defect, but people legislate and choose to cooperate and pay into these things that are for the broader social good. So the solution is you want to use that social choice to get your medical innovation. You don't want to do it on the backs of tyrannical and forced law because it's not sustainable. That's the key distinction. If you're relying on behavior that people are doing on their own choice and they're consenting to, that'll last across time. But when you try to do something, even if it's well-intentioned, like having a medically useful gene bank, but when it's forced, you're going to have all sorts of protest and frustration, and that won't last well across time. And so the only way you could do it is with consented behavior. Therefore, you have to use social trust and not tyrannical laws. And that's all.